Let's talk about sex. But not like in the fun and sexy way. I mean in a way that will involve scientific research, a terrible take on Twitter, and Latin phrases like post hoc ergo propter hoc. I'm a lot of fun at parties. Anyway, here's the thread on Twitter that inspired today's video. Alexandra Hunt, a public health activist, recently tweeted a thread that began with, "Young men aren't having sex. Nearly a third of men under 30 have not had sex, and a higher percent do not have as much sex as they'd like. Not exactly surprising, but this kind of statistic is a sign of much deeper problems." She supported this statement with a graph that, to jump straight to the point, makes it clear that she is already wrong. The graph very obviously states that it shows the share of men and women between ages of 18 and 30 reporting no sex in the past year. Not ever, just the past year. She doesn't cite or link to the article she got this graph from, but luckily the screenshot also shows that the source is the General Social Survey as published in the Washington Post. So a quick search led me to find it. An article titled, "The share of Americans not having sex has reached a record high," from March of 2019. As always, everything I talk about in all of these videos, you can find linked from the transcript so you can read it in full. You can find a link to the transcript on my Patreon. The link to that is in the description below. Neither the chart that Hunt screenshot nor the article it comes from supports any of her assertions beyond the vague young men aren't having sex. It's not nearly a third. It's 28%, which is more like a quarter. It's not that they haven't had sex. It's just in the past year. There's no data in there to suggest that a higher percentage do not have as much sex as they'd like. In fact, last year, a poll by Match found that 81% of men on their platform say they now find sex less important than they did pre-pandemic. And there's no data that says this kind of statistic is a sign of much deeper problems. But as wrong as that first tweet was, I regret to inform you that she decided to turn it into a whole wrong thread. She actually manages to make things worse. Our society criminalizes sex and sweeps it under the rug. The consequences are straightforward. There is more violence. Since platforms like Craigslist were banned from advertising sex, serious violent crimes against all women, not just sex workers, has increased by nearly 1/5. So, first of all, she doesn't include any citation for this. I spent a good hour of my life trying to find any data to suggest that violent crimes against women have increased by 20% since 2010, which is the year that Craigslist shut down their sex worker ads. In fact, most sources seem to agree that violence against women has been decreasing, at least here in the United States, where rates of sexual violence in the U.S., whether measured by arrest or victimization, have declined by over 50% over the last 20 years. The rape and sexual assault victimization rate dropped from over 4 per 1,000, age 12 and older, in 1993 to about 1.3 per 1,000 in 2012. And if you add up all the intimate partner violence, including all rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault committed by spouses, boyfriends, or girlfriends, the rate has dropped from almost 10 per 1,000 in 1994 to 3.2 per 1,000 in 2012. That's not to say it's definitely been decreasing. It's a complicated issue. Different sources say different things. But pretty much everyone agrees that at the time COVID-19 happened, things went haywire. You know, at that point, the United Nations did predict an increase of 20% more cases of domestic violence worldwide. But again, that wasn't due to Craigslist in 2010. That was due to COVID in 2020. And also that was a prediction, not real data. And there we have it, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Just because one thing happened and then another thing happened doesn't mean that the first thing caused the second thing to happen. It's not even clear in this case that the second thing even happened. Still, she persisted. And men who do not have sex suffer. They are less likely to be a part of the labor force and more likely to experience depression, nihilism, and other mental health issues. Now we've arrived at the all-time classic logical fallacy: correlation does not equal causation. Again, she cites no source for any of this, and I couldn't find one. But let's just say she's correct, and men who haven't had sex in the past year are more likely to be unemployed and more likely to experience mental health issues. How do we know that the unemployment and mental health issues aren't the things that are leading to the lack of sex? Depression and anxiety are barriers to finding and keeping a romantic partner, as well as to finding and keeping a job. But finding and keeping that romantic partner is the first step to having sex with someone. We don't know the order of causation here, or if there's any causation at all. She goes on, the Me Too movement accomplished so much, and we have to take the next step, normalizing having healthy, positive, consensual sex, decriminalizing sex work, funding sex education, and creating outreach programs that help young people develop healthy sexual habits. Remarkably, she finally managed to get through an entire tweet that was completely correct. Like, she didn't say anything horribly wrong. Congrats to her. But this has nothing to do with the problem of young men not having sex. Well, not in the way that she seems to think. Some experts do think that one reason young men aren't having as much sex is because of the success of Me Too and comprehensive sexual education that emphasizes things like consent. Young women maybe have higher standards now, better self-esteem, a better understanding of what it is that they want. Maybe men simply haven't quite caught up yet. Despite everything she says being more or less correct in that tweet, suddenly referencing sex work is the first hint that Hunt is about to get very dark and very wrong. So prepare yourselves for this next one. We should be moving toward a right to sex. People should be able to have sex when they feel they want to, and we need to develop services that meet people's needs without attaching the baggage of shame or criminalization. Yikes. Yikes. Right to sex is not a thing that any serious person should ever champion. No one deserves sex. No one has a right to intimacy. There are so many things wrong with this. I'm a little stumped on where to start, but let's just go with this. The line of logic Hunt has laid out says that the lack of sex drives men to violence, and so these violent men should be permitted to be serviced by sex workers so that they won't kill the rest of us. Jesus fucking Christ. Part of the problem here is how we tend to think about incels. Incels, or involuntary celibates, have become a community of angry boys and men, though the term was originally coined by a sexless woman. And these angry boys and men have created an echo chamber where they hype each other up to hate women, to abuse women, and sometimes to kill women. I can't believe I have to say this, but the problem isn't the lack of sex. The problem is the hatred of women, and men abuse and murder women regardless of whether they can get sex. There's a reason why we have an entire category of violence against women known as intimate partner violence. Those intimate partners get sex. Sex is not the problem. There's a reason why we consider sex workers to be particularly at risk of violence at the hands of men. It's not because sex workers aren't giving the men sex. Sex is not the problem. And even if we lived in a world, like a magical world, where giving men sex made them less likely to murder us, we shouldn't sit back and expect sex workers to take on the burden of fucking sociopaths just to keep them peaceful. Like, Jesus Christ. As I mentioned in my video earlier this year on incel terrorism, Researchers have already found that the love of violence is rooted in things like reinforcing masculinity through misogyny. Masculinity is extremely important to these men, and they see sex and violence against women as the two biggest markers of masculinity. Giving them sex doesn't remove violence and hatred as an additional marker of masculinity. Yes, we should decriminalize sex work, but we should do it to protect sex workers from misogyny, not to fuck the misogyny out of incels. To conclude, let me just go back to that Washington Post article that Hunt fails to link to and apparently failed to read. It notes that the drop in young men having sex began around 2008, and let's see, that was so long ago. I forget what happened. So let me just Google what happened in 2008 and then just read you the top result word for word. The 2008 financial crisis began with cheap credit and lax lending standards that fueled a housing bubble. When the bubble burst, the banks were left holding trillions of dollars of worthless investments in subprime mortgages. The Great Recession that followed cost many their jobs, their savings, and their homes. So yeah, that's the year that a whole bunch of people, the majority being young men, had to move back in with their parents. And let me just say, as a woman who enjoys having sex with men, you know what's kind of a real horn kill? The guy's mom popping her head in to see if he'd like snacks and Sunny D's. A poster of Pam Anderson thumbtacked above the bed. A Sega Genesis with one off-brand controller where the X is busted. None of this is a turn-on. The downturn also led to a lot of job losses, and sure enough, someone dug into the data from the General Social Survey and found that the men who weren't having sex were significantly more likely to be either students, unemployed, or partially employed and or low earners. He also found that the biggest driver of sexlessness in young men was if they stated that they weren't married or never married. That jibes with data showing that the age of first marriage in the United States has been steadily rising throughout our history. Men in 1980, for instance, tended to be married by 24, while last year, men tended to wait until about 30. Let me tell you, the sexless marriage trope, dead wrong. Being married is actually a very good way to have access to frequent sex. All that aside, I do think our society is facing a real problem with men who feel disaffected, lonely, and disconnected from society at large. We have an unacceptably large population of men who we have failed to prepare to live in the year of our Lord 2022. Men who don't understand or know how to deal with their own emotions. Men who can't take care of their lives without a maternal presence to take care of them. Men who can't form healthy relationships with other men and women. Men who can't see women as fully functioning human beings. And those are the men who are most likely to fall into these echo chambers where they substitute all of that with hate and violence, because that's the only way they get over this loneliness. Addressing that problem is going to take a lot more effort than just decriminalizing sex work and hoping that the sex workers take care of it.